go. Good morning. This is Deborah Creedy from the South Dakota Department of Education. I'm on contract there to serve as the state E-rate coordinator. And with me today is Michelle Kronberg. She is the state E-rate administrator, and she supervises and oversees all of my work. And also with us today is Cheyenne Shantos, who is working with the state library and providing technology support services as well. So welcome to Michelle and Cheyenne as well. And welcome to all of you who are joining us today. The presentation I posted in the chat, and I'm going to post it once more for anyone who joined us before it was posted. So hopefully now you'll all be able to follow along with it and make notes on it. And I will be sending it to the listserv after we finish the presentation today. Okay, so now I'm going to share my screen and we will get started. There we go. So this is entitled E-rate Essentials and Elements. I tried for some alliteration this year with the E's. And we really are talking primarily today about how to get online to file forms, what has changed with the online filing system, as well as a recap, kind of a nutshell overview, high level of the different elements and the E-rate cycle. Each of those elements then in turn will be the subject of a later module where we'll go into a great bit of more detail. What we have found through experience is that because E-rate is rather complicated, sitting and sort of conveying all this information to you in one sitting, it just becomes too overwhelming. And we think that these modules are really useful because then you can go back and look at the recordings later and look at the PowerPoints if you have specific questions. Okay, so just the basics. What is E-rate? And E-rate is the national program under the Federal Telecommunications Act, and it offers funding to K-12 schools and public libraries for certain technology purchases, and the fund annually is a little bit less than $4.3 billion. So it's the largest technology funding program that the government offers for K-12 schools and libraries. There's two different groups of funding, so they divide that pot of money into two. And the first pot is called Category 1, and that's funding that goes for broadband circuits and internet access, and that's services that go through the network into the buildings, so into an eligible school or library building. Category 2, the second pot of money, is for data network equipment and related services. So this is service and equipment that's used inside schools and libraries to be able to bring broadband internet to students and patrons. The amount of your funding is quantified as a discount off what's called the pre-discount price of the services or equipment. And the pre-discount price is simply the amount that you would pay to a vendor if the E-rate program didn't exist. And the discount percentage is based on a matrix, and that matrix has two different measures of poverty and rural-urban status of your school or library. And importantly, this program requires a competitive bidding in order to reduce that pre-discount price as low as possible. So those are sort of the high-level overview. And there's three key pillars of E-rate that need to be present in order to qualify for funding. So first, the building that is going to house the equipment for Category 2 or is going to receive the Category 1 service, internet access or a data circuit to the building. The building itself has to be classified as an eligible building. And all public, non-public tribal schools are eligible. and libraries that are eligible for LSTA funding, and any administrative building that is part of a school district, or part of a library. Those are called non-instructional facilities, or NIF is the acronym. So the first pillar is the building has to be eligible. The second pillar is that the equipment or service that you want to buy with your E-rate funding is eligible. And we look to an annual eligible services list that is published by the Federal Communications Commission. That's the agency that oversees E-rate. And they have a list, and it itemizes every piece of equipment and service that can qualify for E-rate funding. So this is where the competitive bidding comes in, that once you decide what equipment or service you want to purchase, 9 times out of 10, you have to do a competitive bid for that service or equipment. And we'll talk about that 10th time, which is an exception, as well later in the presentation. But just assume that you have to do a competitive bid. So there's a form for that. And all the competitive bidding is done online at the E-rate portal. And then once you set the price based on your competitive bidding, you then take your E-rate discount and you apply that to the cost of that service or equipment. And that amount is what you then quantify as your E-rate funding. So that's the amount of the price of the goods or services that the E-rate program would pay for, and then you would be responsible for paying the balance. And the discount matrix, which ranges from a 20% discount all the way up to a 90% discount for category 1, is based again on your poverty level, which is determined by the school district's national school lunch percentage. So if you're a library, you don't have that data. So what you would do is look to the school district's data that your library is located. So if you're located, if you're a Custer library, you'd look to Custer School District, for example. And then the rural and urban status is not what we would think of as rural or urban, but it's how the program rules define it. So rural and urban in our state means that basically only portions of Aberdeen, Minnehaha, and I'm drawing a blank, Rapid City, that county would be classified. All other parts of the state are classified as rural. Just those urban centers have that urban designation. The only difference here is that if you're designated as rural, then depending on where you are in that poverty level scale, you could qualify for a higher discount than your urban counterpart would. So those are the 3 pillars of E-rate. So here are some resources. So if you're brand new and you're trying to just wrap your head around things, I wanted to give you some very basic resources, not to overwhelm you, but just to kind of get familiar. So first, there's a website. USAC has a website for E-rate, and then they also have a specific link for how to get started. They also have an 8-page, rather a overview of 1-page process flow chart, and I've actually replicated that later in the slides. And then they have an 8-page summary of the program. So these are USAC official resources. USAC, by the way, stands for the Universal Service Administrative Company. So they're a nonprofit company that was set up at the direction of the Federal Communications Commission. And they're the company that is responsible for the day-to-day administration of the program. Inside that company is a division that's devoted to E-rate. And that division is called the Schools and Libraries Division. So I'm going to stop my screen share here, and I'm going to show you what that website looks like just to get you familiar with what I'm talking about. So let me go up here, and can you, let me stop the share and then start the share one more time so you can see that page. So this is the E-rate website, and you can see that all the different programs that we're not going to talk about today, but they're all different universal service programs. We're going to talk about E-rate, obviously, and you can see here that there is a process on how it works, and you can walk through that process with them. So they have each of these steps are described at a very high level overview, but that's a really good place to start. At the end of the presentation, I'll show you some other state-specific resources that we've developed that also attempt to provide you with all of the information you need to answer all of your questions on all things E-rate. So that kind of gives you a sense of the E-rate, kind of what the website looks like. And I mention this because there is so much information on that website that it can be daunting and also helpful. Their search engine has improved over the last few years. So if you insert a term in the search function, they typically will return some results, and you can try to get your try to get an answer to your question. So I mentioned that they have the flow chart, and this is their flow chart. And it shows you sort of the way they put it together. And the top section is for an applicant. So the school and the library, the applicants, they're the ones that do the bidding. They're the ones that file the application for funding. So you can see that they start with competitive bidding, which I mentioned, and you have to do a bid evaluation, and you make a vendor selection. And once you do that, then you may have to sign a contract. We'll talk about that in a few slides. Then once you have the prices set and the service and equipment that you want to buy, then you file for your E-rate discount funding, and that's done through the 471. So these are FCC standard forms that everybody files the same form, basically, and everything is done online in a filing portal. Then once the form is filed for funding requests, then they have pre-funding review, which is called Program Integrity Assurance. Once they go through the pre-funding review and they verify that your services and your discounts are properly calculated, then you would get your funding approval letter. Once you get that, then you're in the gray section, and the gray section is, well, you start to receive your services. Now, to receive your services or to purchase your equipment, you have to file another form, and that's called the Form 486, and that certifies that you're actually going to use the money that you were approved for funding, and you're also going to certify that you're compliant with the Children's Internet Protection Act, or CIPA. Once you get your services, then you have two options for doing getting you the E-rate discounts. One option is to ask your service provider to only bill you for the portion that you're responsible for paying, and would reflect the E-rate discount funding as a credit. In that method, the service provider would then be responsible for invoicing to the fund to get the E-rate discount funding. The other option is that you would pay your bill in full as though the E-rate program didn't exist, and then you would be responsible for applying for reimbursement for the invoice to the program to get your E-rate discount funding. That's the program in a nutshell. It's unlike a regular grant program where you write the application, you know the criteria, you tell the grantor what you're going to do with the money, you get a lump sum of money, you get to then use it and then write a report or submit your reporting requirements. This is different in that there is a lot of work that you need to do before you can get that funding. And then there's reporting and work to be done after you get approved for the funding. So it's a more of a cycle than it is like a start and a finish line. It's sort of, it goes through the whole year, and I'll show you through calendars and other illustrations what that might look like. So this is their overview, okay? This is my overview, where what I try to do is break it down into just a little bit more basic steps and to give some timing to the sequence. So I'm going to start at the beginning and then just keep going around. And there's some repetition intentionally included in this presentation. Because remember, this is for newbies or newcomers. And I want you to be able to hear the terms and the sequence a couple of times so that you can start to get a sense of it and to get a handle on it. So for those of you experienced veterans, bear with me as you hear this a couple times. So first, we start with the assessment and planning, which means figuring out what you need to get E-rate funding for based on reviewing the eligible services list and based on your current inventory of equipment. So you figure out your needs, and then you figure out of those needs, what will E-rate pay for? Once you do that, then you're going to then have two steps that are going to occur basically simultaneously. Looking realistically that we're now in October, once you complete your assessment, you can skip to the third box and actually prepare and file your Form 470, your bidding request form. Also, simultaneously, there is a process with the online filing system, which occurs each year, sometime beginning in October. The date has not yet been announced, so it's TBD. And it will end sometime in December, maybe January. And these are not set dates. They change each year. So that's why we don't yet know what these dates are. But what you would do is on the online filing portal, you have the opportunity to look at all of the data that the E-rate program has for each of your buildings. And you would then update that information if anything has changed, such as the name, address, and for schools, if you have new updated enrollment numbers and updated National School Lunch Program numbers. You would update that information. Libraries, you have other fields that can be updated, such as name, address, as well as your square footage, because your square footage is going to determine how much money you get for the Category 2 part of the program. Okay, so stay with me. So you've done your assessment and planning. Now you're going to file your 470, and there's a 28-day minimum mandatory bidding period. So during that period, you would need to allow service providers to submit bids. And at the conclusion of the 28th day, on the 29th day, you could start to review and evaluate those bids. You would review and evaluate those bids based on the E-rate program rules. We'll talk a little bit about that later, and select what's called the most cost-effective bidder. So this cost-effective standard means that you have to consider price as the highest weighted factor, but you're allowed to consider other non-cost factors in determining the best solution for your entity, for your school or library. And that's what cost effective is the standard. After you've done your bid evaluation, then you'll need to look to whether you need to sign a contract. Because these contracts are required to be signed before you can file for your funding, the contracts typically have a contingency clause that states that you're signing the contract before you know E-rate funding is going to be approved, and therefore your contract will be contingent on obtaining that E-rate funding approval, which means that if you don't get the funding approval, the contract is void and you're not obligated to purchase the equipment or service. If you have a local school or library policy that requires contracts to be approved by your governing board, then you would need to build time into your schedule to get that board approval before you can file for your funding. Once the contract has been approved and signed by the school or library, that's when you then go back into the online filing system and you do something called create a contract record. So each of the contracts that you sign has to become a record so that it is in your system and in your online filing portal so that you can then refer to that contract when you complete your 471. So there's a contract module. You are, for all Category 2 funding requests, you're required to have a contract. For Category 1 service, whether you sign a contract or receive the service just paying month to month without signing a contract is between you and the winning vendor. Some vendors may require a contract to be signed, others may not. If you want to enter into a multi-year arrangement for service, then you absolutely need a contract to be signed. So we'll talk at a later time and place about contracts and all of those details. But again, you can see kind of backing up from the deadline that there's a number of steps that need to be considered when creating your timeline for applying for E-rate. So then the next thing that happens is then you're going to file the application, the funding application after you create the contract record. And the deadline for doing this, it will start sometime in January. It's called a filing window. So what that means is beginning the first day up through the deadline, which is usually the last week in March, it's usually on a Wednesday or Thursday. Then all of the applications filed within that window have equal access to that pot of $4.3 billion. If you file after that deadline, then you have to get special approval for your application to even be considered. So this is a hard and fast deadline. It will be announced likely right before Christmas vacation. So we'll know when you get back, usually from holiday vacation. The filing window usually opens around the second or third week in January and closes the end of March. It's usually open for about 75 days. Now, looking backward, when you looked at that 470 and you know you have that 28-day mandatory bidding period, and you have to do the bid evaluation, you have to get the contract signed and also get a board approved if that's a local requirement. You can see that there's a lot of work that has to be done to lead you to be in a position to be able to file that application during the filing window. So once you complete your 471, your funding application, then it goes through a pre-application review. So think of this as a pre-funding approval audit. This is where the program administrator is going to evaluate your application to make sure that it complies with all the different program requirements. So what happens is when as soon as you file your application, usually they'll start the pre-funding reviews. What usually happens is like more than 75% of the applications are filed the very last week of the deadline. So the pre-funding reviews start in earnest once the deadline for the 471 has passed. And then what happens is applications start to get funded, and they get funded on a weekly basis in a group of letters, all of which are sent to you electronically, and that's called a wave. So each week they will issue a wave of letters. And that starts usually late April, and that will continue for months and months until they're finished reviewing all the applications. Most applicants receive their letters sometime in late April through August, even September or October. You know, people still have not gotten funded yet for this year. So the application, this service period starts in July 1. So July 1, 2022. So that's why you're doing all of this work, and you have to apply for funding before the funding period begins. Then once you get your funding approval letter, you have to then file the Form 486, which is basically to activate the funding, which means that the service provider, if they bill you for only the portion that you're not responsible for paying, so that they are responsible for billing the program for the E-rate discounts, you have to have that Form 486 on file and approved in order for that service provider to get paid, or for you as the applicant, if you use the reimbursement method, for your reimbursement to be approved. So once you file the 486, that's when you would purchase the equipment or service, and you would either pay the vendor, you're going to pay the vendor either for the non-discounted share, the amount that is not paid by the E-rate program, or you're going to pay them in full and then request the reimbursement yourself. Notice the red line that says you can purchase equipment as early as August 1 and pay in full, and that applies for Category 2 equipment. So if you need the equipment, even if you haven't gotten your funding approval, you're allowed to order it as early as April 1, but you're not going to have your funding approval when you place the order, which means that you're going to have to pay for it in full and await receipt of your funding approval letter before you can then get your reimbursement. So that's the big picture from a process standpoint. And then I simply tried to convert it into a calendar format and to show you how some of the years overlap. So everything in funding year 22 is going to be in brown, and anything that's a deadline, that's a hard and fast deadline, is going to be in red. So I talked about, like, funding year 2022, the admin window to do your entity updates is going to open sometime in October, we expect. And then you saw here we would post the 470 into your bid evaluation, and then you would also do your admin updates. And so you can see your admin updates, you would have October through sometime in January to get those done. And similarly with the posting of the 470, you can do that right now, or you can wait a little bit, but you can get started in earnest in filing these applications and getting your E-rate forms underway. What's in red over here is that from a prior year, we've got a deadline coming up. And for the year that ended June 30, 2021, if you received services or paid for equipment that E-rate had approved and you paid in full, then you've got to file your reimbursement form by October 28th. Now that's for recurring services, meaning that would be for broadband circuits, internet access, and also for maintenance services are usually considered recurring services. We also have a deadline, same day, for a different form and a different year. So for the year that we're in, so the year that began July 1st, 2021, we have the deadline for filing that Form 486 to turn on the funding. So if you received your funding approval letter before July 2nd, so meaning July 1st and earlier, then you've got a hard and fast deadline of October 28th to file that 486. If you receive your funding approval letter later, then you have 120 days from the date of that letter to file that 486. But because you may want to order equipment or receive services, you're going to not want to wait that 4 months, that 120 days. You're going to want to file that form sooner rather than later. So then similarly, back in, if you look forward to the January 2022 date, we've got a deadline there, and that's for funding year 2020, the year that ended June 30, 2021. If you had what's called a non-recurring service funding, so that would be for equipment or any one-time costs, then you've got to get your reimbursement form filed by that date. What I do is send out lists and reminder lists to help you know whether you have to file these forms. So rather than overwhelm the listserv, I wanted to have this session first, and I've got those lists teed up, and I'll be sending out messages to the listserv. So then all you do is look on the list to see if you're there, and that gives you the information you need to then start to investigate internally whether you've got to file the form or whether your service provider, it's their responsibility because they gave you the discounted bills, meaning they gave you the bill that reflected the E-rate discount funding as a credit. That's called discounted billing. So then what I did is I put down, like in March 2022, we know that there's going to be the 471 deadline. We just don't know the exact date, so it's to be determined. And then you can see each of these steps. After that, you have the ability to submit certain corrections to your 471 if you made errors. And then I had down here that you'll start the PIA process, or the pre-funding review questions. And here I started, okay, so our funding approval letters are probably going to start in late April. So here you're going to start to file your 486. And I have that listed in June and July because we don't know exactly what your deadline is going to be, because that's going to be keyed off of when you get your funding decision letter. So then I go back to the cycle, and now here we go all over again in October 2022. We've got those 3 deadlines coming up, right? We've got the 470 for funding year 2021, the year ending June 30, 2022. Now we have to file our recurring service bearers. And for funding year 2022, the year that we just started, now we've got the 486 deadline. So you can see how October in particular shows very clearly how the 3 different funding years can overlap in that particular month. And you can see that there's some overlap between October and January of each year, because you're filing the reimbursement forms to clear out and get your money from the prior year while you're now already starting in earnest to get ready to apply for funding for the next year. So that part of the presentation really gave you kind of a very high level overview of what the program is like at the 50,000-foot level. Now I want to talk and pivot to how you actually get access to the online filing system. Because like any filing system that you may have other experiences with, it is not always intuitive, and there's some oddities to it. So just want to walk you through the basics on how to get access and get into the portal. So the portal is nicknamed EPC or EPIC, or E-Rate Productivity Center. So you've got a user ID, which is your email address, and you've got to create a password, but there's now a multi-factor authentication or MFA. So if you're new to E-Rate, you can be pretty confident that you're not going to be set up as a user. But if you're part of the organization and you're not sure whether your user credentials have been set up, then you would go to the portal and you would try to get into it by using the forget password link. This system, one of the quirks of it is the user ID is case sensitive, and all of the letters in your email address, which is your user ID, have to be in lowercase. So then you would use the reset email button, and if you don't receive a system generated email from Epic within about 2 to 3 minutes, then you can assume that you're not set up, and that your next step would then to be created as a user in the system. So to do that, the easiest way to do it is that if the person in your organization that is responsible for managing the account, they're called the account administrator, they have the ability to go into their portal and create you as a new user. If the person who is designated as the account administrator is no longer with your organization, then you would need to contact the Customer Client Service Bureau and ask them to set you up as a new user. They will then walk you through the process. They will send you an email with all the information that you would need to provide. They would then set you up as a user. You would then go into the system and validate your credentials and agree to the terms and conditions. And then if you want to become the account administrator because the person left your organization, then you would need to actually contact the Client Service Bureau again and ask them to set you up as the account administrator, because you don't have the ability to make that change from your side of the platform. So multi-factor identification is through the One Portal interface. So when you go to the login page for E-Rate, there is a sign in button, and you would then log in to the page, and you would see a screen that looks like this, and it requires you to then hit the continue button. So this is this screen you'll see every time you log into the portal. Now, the next thing you're going to do to initially set up your multi-factor authentication is you're going to not sign in with your username or your password. You're going to use this forget password link, and then the system will create the screen for resetting the password by entering your email address. We'll then send a system automated link to reset your password. which is good for about an hour, for 1 hour. The link then is going to be embedded in the email sent from noreply@usac.org. You're going to then reset your password. And this is the way that you also initially set a password, even though it says a new password or to reset it, it's also how you initially set it. So there's the password conventions, 8 characters, uppercase, lowercase, 1 number, 1 special character. And it can't be a repeat of your last 8 passwords. So then once you reset your password, that's when you get the multi-factor authentication screen. And so this is the email authentication. And notice that the email is pre-populated. You would then select send email. You'll get yet another automated email address, an email message with a 6-digit verification code, which you then enter, verify, and then you're in the system. There are ways to switch your authentication method from email to your text phone message if you prefer. That's a little bit more advanced, and it has to do with your preference settings when you go into the system. Okay, so if your email address is associated with only Epic or only what's called the BEAR filing system, the reimbursement system, you'll see this message. And it'll say either manage my authentication settings or continue. So if you want to add your text phone number as an option for your authentication, then you would select the manage my authentication settings. But if you just want to go into the system, you would then keep going. If you select continue, then you're going to get to your dashboard page. And the dashboard page has 3 different options that you can go into 3 different parts of the system. So the E-Rate Productivity Center is for filing most of your E-Rate forms. That's going to be the top. If you want to file a reimbursement form or the 472, that's going to be the middle button. And then last and newly added, if you're going to want to file an emergency connectivity fund application, you would then select the 3rd option below. Note that, and this is for some of our veterans, if you select the BEAR choice, you want to file a reimbursement form, up until this year, there was a separate PIN required to get into the BEAR system. That no longer is required. So if you press that 472 option, you then automatically are directed to the applicant login. And all you need to do is enter your BEN or BIN. It stands for Build Entity Number. So that's like it's the equivalent of a Social Security number for E-Rate. That is your organization's number that all of your forms are filed under. And then you would log into the BEAR system. If for whatever reason you need to file the BEAR and this option doesn't come up, or this doesn't work when you log in, then there is a way to request your login email to be associated with the BEAR filing system. So just to review, EPC or Epic, you file just about all forms other than the reimbursement form. So if you don't see this option on your dashboard, you're going to fill out what's called the PIN template file, which is available at this link here. And you're then going to go back into the Epic and submit a customer service case and request that your user ID or email be linked to your entity. So that explains how you would go about doing that. And I will post the Bear Access template in the chat once I'm done the formal presentation, in case any of you need that. So now I'm going to go through the calendar again, but talk now a little bit in more detail about each of the steps. So we talked about this admin window, which is the beginning period for when you can make these updates has not yet been announced. And it usually goes until mid-January of the upcoming year. So this is where you would verify and update the name and address of each building. Schools would update their student enrollment and NSLP numbers. Libraries, if your square footage has changed, you would update that. And if you have buildings that closed or buildings that opened, you would then add those buildings or have them removed. And you would need to do that through a customer service case, because you don't have the actual authority or rights to create a new entity, but you can use the customer service case function to make that request. Now, usually pre-COVID, schools would use their data from the October before the filing period. So for this year, it would be the October 2021 data. You would then use that, update your enrollment and your NSLP numbers based on that data. Or you were even allowed to use more recent data. Like if you had an influx of students after your October data, you could use that more recent data. In the last 2 years, though, since COVID occurred and USDA has waived the NSLP rules so that all schools can serve free lunches to all students and get reimbursed, what we found is that the October numbers for 2020 really weren't accurate. They may have undercounted either enrolled students or NSLP students. They undercount NSLP students, and that's going to reduce your poverty percentage and would then decrease your E-rate discount. So last year, the Federal Communications Commission specifically said you didn't have to use the fall 2020 data, you could continue to use the fall 2019 data, because that was the most recent accurate data available. So we're waiting to hear whether the FCC is going to continue to allow applicants to use that fall 2019 data, or whether they are going to be compelled to update it with the more current data. The idea is that the rule says that you have to use the most recent available information, but we also think that there has to be a caveat that it's not just the most recent information, but it also has to be accurate. So if the most recent information from fall 2021 isn't really accurate or it's skewed because of the USDA waiver, we don't really think that that would make sense to continue to rely on that data. Now, the student enrollment numbers are used not only to calculate your E-rate discount by calculating your NSLP percentage. It also is used to create your Category 2 budgets for schools. And the way that the online portal works is that you have two sets of enrollment data that doesn't necessarily have to match. You've got enrollment data for calculating your discounts, and then you've got enrollment data for calculating your Category 2 budgets. So theoretically, you could use your fall 2019 NSLP and enrollment data to calculate your discounts, but then use your more updated fall 2021 enrollments to calculate your Category 2 budgets. So we talked about the assessment and planning, and we talked a little bit about that you would go to look at the annual eligible services list that's published each year. And you would look at that list to see what services and equipment are eligible, and you would compare that list to what your needs are. So in the nutshell, category 1, which is not a limited, there's no budget for category 1, is going to be broadband internet access and transmission service. And transmission service is a fancy way of saying these are the circuits, the high-speed circuits that are used to have building-to-building connections or like a wide area network, or the circuit is the facility that the internet travels over to deliver internet to your buildings. So all buildings, schools, libraries, and admin buildings are eligible for category 1. And the service can be obtained month-to-month, non-contract, or via a multi-year contract. Category 2 is limited. Those admin buildings are not eligible for category 2. It's only the school and library buildings to transmit internet to classrooms and for libraries to have it available for patron usage. So there's 3 subcategories under category 2. There's network equipment, and that's all listed there, and basic maintenance. So the basic maintenance is for the eligible network equipment. And the 3rd subcategory is managed internal broadband service. So this is service provided by like a third-party vendor to operate, manage, and monitor your internal connections, your network equipment. And then, as I mentioned, each applicant is assigned a budget for your category 2 purchase. So everybody gets this, calculates the budget, and then you would look to your E-rate discount and apply that E-rate discount to your budget to figure out how much E-rate funding is available. So the way that the budgets work, and they did this because of concerns over the up until 2015 when the program was revamped, there consistently was not enough money to fund everyone's network equipment requests. So they decided to reduce the group of equipment that's eligible for funding and also to put everybody on a budget. So school districts with 10 or fewer schools have 3 options to calculate your budget. So you would do your district enrollment times $167 per student, or you could do the number of your schools and just multiply by $25,000. Or you could do the greater amount of each of those options. And then you would add up the budget per building to arrive at your overall school district budget. Independent schools can use whatever the best approach is most advantageous, the greater amount of enrollment times $167 or the minimum building amount of $25,000. So this is a budget that's a 5-year cycle. So this is the pot of money that's been reserved from the E-rate program for your organization to use over 5 years. And it's in any combination of that 5-year. You can skip years, you can wait until last year, you can use it, a couple years, you can use it all in 1 year. It's completely up to you. The cycle just started this year. So 2021 was the first year of that 5-year cycle. And libraries have a similar option where there's a $25,000 minimum for each building, or you can multiply that by the number of buildings, or you can take your total square footage multiplied by $4.50 per square foot. And if you have 10 or fewer branches, then you can do what I call the mix and match. So you can either do the square footage calculation or take the floor amount of $25,000 and multiply by the number of your library buildings, or you can do whatever's most advantageous. The mix and match option, where you take the minimum amount for some buildings, you take the square footage calculation for other buildings to arrive at your maximum category 2 budget. So there is an online budget tool that calculates your budgets based on the most advantageous method. And what I usually do as soon as this tool has been updated for the funding approvals for the current year, I will then pull down the data for South Dakota applicants, and then I'll send that out to all of you on the listserv so you can see exactly how much money the program is showing is available for your organization. So the competitive bidding process is done inside Epic, and there's a tab for filing the forms. And that form opened July 1 of 2021. So it's already active, so you can go into the form now and create your 470 once you identify the products and services you want to purchase. And you would then look for prior years 470s if you want to take a look at what you've requested in the past, or maybe borrow some of the language that you use from the past. There is a option inside Epic on your landing page to then look for your 470s that were posted in prior years. Once you've waited the 28-day bidding period, then you have the opportunity to look to do a bid evaluation and select the most cost-effective bidder. So I mentioned that non-cost factors can be included, but the price of the E-rate eligible services and equipment has to be weighted heavier than any other factor. So once you select your vendor, determine whether you need a contract, and if you need a contract, whether it requires board approval. I do recommend that you include the contingency clause language in case you don't get E-rate approval. And remember that you still have to sign that contract before you can file and certify your 471, which is why that contingency clause is so important, because they're requiring you to have a signed contract before you file, but they won't tell you whether you've got approval until you file. So the contingency clause is your bridge there that allows you to sign the contract, but not be concerned about having that obligation if E-rate doesn't get approved. So then we talked about the contract record, which has to be entered into your online filing portal. And you would then, there's a tab for doing that. It's under contracts, and then there's something called managed contracts. And you are required to provide like the number of bids you receive, identify the 470 that was asked for bids that led to you signing that contract. It'll ask for the date of the award and the date of the expiration and whether there are any extensions. So all of this is in the online system. There's a guide I created for contract records that we'll share with you at the appropriate time. And then the main event, you've done the bidding, you've done the contract signing, you've entered the contract information Epic. Now you're ready to file the funding application. So that window is going to open usually sometime around mid-January and closes mid to late March. And the dates are TBD. Usually they're announced in November, December. And then you would quantify and identify and itemize all the equipment and service that you want to get E-rate funding for. And you would also identify the buildings that are going to receive that service or equipment for category 1. The categories The application system is different for each of the two different categories. So if you have category 1 request and category 2, then that requires you to file 2 separate forms. Then we've got the pre-funding review after the 471 has been filed. And they're going to validate your discount, whether the service or equipment is eligible, whether you complied with the competitive bidding process and waited your 28 days, and things like that. So everything is done through the online portal. You get an email stating that an information request is waiting for you. And then you would log into the portal, look for that request, and then complete the information and send it back within 15 days. And you do have the ability to automatically get 1 week extension and possibly more if you have a legitimate reason for asking for more time. So then the end of April, the funding decisions start to get issued in those waves. And the person who's listed as the contact person for the 471, as well as the account administrator, will get emailed a copy of the letter. So this quantifies how much money you've gotten, and it also identifies if there's been any reductions or disapprovals. And you can also obtain a copy of it in case you lose that email inside your portal in the notification section. If you get a denial or reduction in funding and you think that it was wrong, then you can file an appeal, and you have 60 days to do so. And the appeal has to be submitted initially to the administrator, SLD or USAC. And then if they deny the appeal, you have a further right to appeal to the Federal Communications Commission. So then you would have an additional 60 days to file that appeal. And then once you get your funding decision letter, you've got 120 days from the date of that letter or October 28th, whichever date is later, to file the 486. So essentially, for anyone who received a funding decision letter from July 1st, 2021 or earlier, you've got a deadline of October 28th to file the 486. And again, that is an option that's done through Epic. And all of these items on page 35 in that little My Applicant landing page, those are all hyperlinks to new pages inside your portal. And then once the funding year starts, then you would receive your services or order your equipment. And if you're paying in full, then you can invoice the administrator for the discount funding, or else your service provider can bill you through the discounted billing method. And then the service provider is responsible for billing the E-rate program for the discount funding. So now here are some additional resources that are state-based that I wanted to bring to your attention, as well as some additional USAC. So we have a state listserv that you can sign up for at that link. And we also have an E-rate page on the Department of Education's website. And there are training guides and PowerPoints, as well as YouTube videos of prior presentations. You can email me or call me as the state E-rate coordinator, because I am on staff and responsible for helping answer your questions. And I operate a help desk. So if you get stuck or you're not sure what to do, you should contact me, and I try to help as best I can. Now, the E-rate Administrator Schools and Libraries Division has news briefs that used to be done weekly, but then they took a hiatus, and we just learned they're going to start resuming them, but they're only going to do them monthly. And they're emailed out to you, so you can sign up. And also you can go to their page, to their website, where all of the past issues are stored, and you can review them. At this page, the E-rate website page, we have a training manual that is contains information and content, not only from the E-rate website, but also some individual content that I've created, some guides and some tips and tricks and things like that. So when we did in-person training, we would make it available physically. Now we're posting it online, chapter by chapter. So then you can download the particular chapter and look at that material or additional information. We'll be working on updating that for this year. I'm in the process of doing that. This PowerPoint will go in it and all the other PowerPoints that I present. So things to check on. Do you have to file any bears? And I'll send out that list after the presentation. And you have to file 486 for this year. And how to figure out what funding has been approved. And I'll show you how to get that information. But first, I wanted to turn off the recording. Actually, I think I'm going to pause and instead I'm going to do the demonstration while the recording is going, and then we'll stop the recording and take questions. And I will look to the questions in the chat at the end. So let me go back to the E-rate website. So I'm at the E-rate website page, and I'm going to go to something called Tools. Tools have all of the data mining options, I would say. So what I would look at here is I want a funding tool. I want to know, it's called the Frn Status Tool. So this gives me information related to the 471s and the funding request. So that's the individual money that's associated with a particular service or a particular equipment and a particular service provider. So whoever you made the award to, that service provider is listed as the vendor. So you can go into this tool and here, if I want to know how much funding has been approved for South Dakota, what I do is I go in and I select South Dakota and I select nothing else. I keep everything in, and I'd rather get all of the data and then filter it. But if you prefer to just get your own data, you would look up your bin. So that would be your 6-digit number if you're a school district beginning 134. And if you're a library, your number may be completely different, not necessarily 6 digits. And if you're an independent school, not a public school district, your number will likely not start with 134. So I'm going to pull all the records for South Dakota, and I'm going to go down to select data points. And instead of me filtering, I could just select all of them. I like to try to zero in on the specific data I'm looking for. So you could either select all and filter, or if you know exactly what you're looking for, you can choose the specific fields. Like I don't want the nickname here because that's just going to take up space and it doesn't really help me figure out who's been funded or who needs to do different tasks. I am going to look at the FRN status because that's going to tell me whether it is under review or has been committed. And I'm also going to look at the 471 status and the review status. I don't care about what 470 you relied on, but then I'm going to look at the bin. So that's the individual number that the program is assigned to you and your name. I might want to know the type because there's schools, libraries, consortia. I don't really care about your address, but I do want to know who your 470 contact is in your email, because if I have to email somebody about your form, I want to know who that is. And then I also want to know who the account administrator is, because I typically will not just email the contact, but I'll also email the account administrator so that I've got two people that I'm reaching out to ensure that somebody sees my email messages. And then here, if you use a consultant, I could ask for the consultant name and registration number. But 9 times out of 10, if you're using a consultant, that consultant is going to be the 471 contact. But I'll just check that anyway. And then I want to know who the service provider is and their unique identification information, and whether they filed what's called a SPAC. So that's another form. Applicants don't have to file it, only service providers do, but it has to be filed in order for a service provider or an applicant to get paid. Here is what's really important. If I want to know whether someone has to file a 486, if this field here, 486 service start date, is empty, then I know that a 486 has not yet been approved. If I was concerned about whether there were invoices that had to be filed, I would select last date to invoice. And that would tell me what the deadline is. And then down here, it would tell me whether the invoicing has been done or not. But in this one, I'm not going to ask for original. So this is the data what you originally requested versus the updated data based on the pre-funding review in your funding commitment decision letter. So I'm only going to look for the summary here, the program, pre-discount amount, the discount, the amount of funding approved, type of service. And I'm also going to look here for your funding commitment decision letter date and whether somebody in your organization has looked at that letter, and that's date user generated SCDL. So this is just giving you an idea of how you could look at your data. Again, you could just look and select all. It's going to build the data file. I'm going to save it to my system. It's going to be a CSV report. So I'm going to just say today's date. I'm going to put funding year 2021. I can then open this. And this shows me all of the data for South Dakota for funding year 2021. So for example, you can see, I'll just use South Dakota, the state network. You can see that we received funding for all of this service. You can see my name's up there, because I'm the contact person, and that shows us all of the money that we got. And I did not generate the SCDL because I got it in my email, so I didn't have to go in the system. But that would tell you. Okay. So I want to back to the screen. I'm going to stop recording and stop sharing. And I will